2024 had some incredible games, and then there were these. The ones that made us rage, laugh, or just sit there wondering, how did this even get released? Or why did I open my wallet for this? Well, I did for this video. What's your excuse? I played all of these games, so you don't have to. They came in all shapes and sizes, from massive AAA projects with budgets higher than any amount I'll ever see in my life, to tiny indie games. Somehow, these 10 games have managed to fumble the basics. Some of these games promised the world with flashy trailers, big name studios hyping them up, and others snuck quietly into the scene, hoping no one would notice how bad they actually were. But trust me, we noticed. Bugs, terrible design, awkward mechanics, you name it, these games had it all. Maybe it was a multiplayer game that forgot how servers worked, or forgot to turn them on, or a story-driven title that felt like it was written by AI. Or hey, maybe the game just didn't work at all. Whatever the reason, they all earned their spot on this list. So I played the top 10 worst games of 2024, so you didn't have to. So grab your controller, or maybe just your popcorn. You probably don't want to play these. And let's get into it. First on our list is Unknown 9 Awakening. Now, when I first saw this game got horrible reviews and a one-digit Steam player count, I was kind of surprised. The game's premise is really cool. You're able to look into the spirit world known as the Fold, allowing you to use almost Star Wars Force-like powers, as well as enter people's bodies, detect people through walls, stealth attack people, and you pull their spirit out of their body and just slice it. The premise of the game was fresh, new, and so very poorly executed. Where do we start? Outside of the stealth, the combat feels really stiff. Dodging an enemy's attack feels like you need to be so pinpoint accurate, you need the ability to slow down time. If you're even the tiniest bit early, the enemy will sort of just slide towards your location and smack you in the face. It really doesn't feel great. The quests feel extremely generic. It's very much just go here, do that, do this, get that, find her. Unknown 9 Awakening gives gamers no real reason to pay attention to any aspect of the story or the gameplay. But the thing that really pushed me over the edge to include it on this list was the voice acting. Now, that's not to say the voice acting as a whole was bad. It was okay. But in the opening tutorial zone, you are sprinting to your destination, jumping, climbing, but the voice acting just feels stiff. If you closed your eyes, you'd assume the characters were just standing still, having a conversation. There's no breathing or panting while they're sprinting, they're just there, chatting to a mate. This is just a horrible way to introduce the players to the game, especially after they promise such a deep and interesting story. Before you get into your first combat sequence, you fall down a small cliff, and your companion conveys absolutely zero urgency, despite the enemy coming at you with a lightning charged stick thing. Unknown 9 Awakening was a disappointing new IP from publisher Bandai Namco. While a much smaller budget compared to other games of the year, the game still cost $50 to $100 million to produce. And it's asking you to fork out $50 to $60 US, which is almost 100 here in Australia. Now, you can find the game for 10 or 20 bucks, which is a much more reasonable price for the game, but I still can't recommend picking it up. Unless you want to buy my copy. I kind of have some buyer's regret. King Kong. Everyone loves King Kong. And being able to play a game that features a giant gorilla and other titans is a dream come true for some people. Now, the developer 7 Levels literally had the easiest thing in the world to follow. The last King Kong game was so bad it triggered a global meme just because of its graphics. Now, Kong Survival Instinct is a 2.5D platformer where you play as a dad looking for his lost daughter in a city filled with the Titans. The game is set just after Godzilla defeated Mechagodzilla, but Kong has for some reason returned to the surface, and you do find out why, so I'm glad it's not a massive plot hole. Now, overall, the game itself isn't actually that bad, which is why it's number 9 on the list. But personally, I felt like the controls were a little clunky, nothing major. If you're a fan of Kong and Godzilla Monsterverse thing, whatever they call it, and you're just looking for a bite-sized game to jump into, you probably will really enjoy this. But Jack, why are you saying it's one of the worst games of 2024? Well, my child, the writing. I can overlook weird animations, average voice acting, and clunky combat. But the ending, I cannot forgive. We're going to talk about the ending, so spoiler warning. Alright, cool, you're never going to play this game, so let's talk about the ending. The final mission, you see Kong fight Tneumata and Abaddon, but we don't see the outcome. The entire mission, you see them fighting in the background, and it is really cool. But at the end, Kong just leaves. You don't even see him leave. He just disappears. It's like he's literally been deleted via a console command. And then Tneumata and Abaddon just swim away like stupid overgrown eels. It is the most unsatisfying ending ever. I had to Google the ending of the game just to make sure there wasn't a different ending and I got the bad ending, or I had accidentally skipped some sort of cutscene. But at least it's not Skull Island Rise of Kong. South Park The Stick of Truth and Fractured But Whole was a blast. So when South Park Snow Day released back in March of 2024, I was actually really looking forward to playing it. I love South Park. Can you tell? But a week after the game's launch and a quick read of reviews, I didn't let that deter me. I wanted to play Snow Day. I should have let it deter me. The game was so uninspired. It was nothing like the previous South Park games. The comedy that people love so much about the South Park franchise felt watered down. The change to third person was confusing, I guess. And dare I say it, Ubisoft got this one right. The Ubisoft South Park games were miles better in their turn-based RPG style than Snow Day is a roguelike button masher, which is a fine genre. I like some good button mashers. But South Park Snow Day lacks variety. There's a few melee weapons, a couple ranged weapons, and you get access to a good amount of abilities, but you can only actually equip 2 at once, and it doesn't really provide that much variety. The game takes about 5 hours to complete and 10-ish to 100% it, but it will be the longest 5 hours of your life. The game feels like an endless enemy spawner, and your weapons feel like you're just bonking them on the head even though they're 3 years old. For reference, the tutorial or the first mission took me about 45 minutes to complete. Not because I died. I didn't die at all. It's just the enemies felt ridiculously tanky, or you just felt like you weren't doing any damage. I couldn't really decide. South Park Snow Day deserves its number 8 spot here because if you're not a massive gamer and you just like South Park, you'll enjoy this quick little game. But if you're someone who is looking forward to the successor of Stick of Truth or Fractured But Whole, you're going to be incredibly disappointed. Like me. I hope South Park goes back to Ubisoft, can't believe I said that, because Snow Day completely missed the mark. I remember about a week before Taxi Life was released, everyone was super excited about it. You'd be able to run your taxi business, hire employees, buy new cars, repair your cars, the works. Taxi Life sees you driving around a virtual recreation of Barcelona. There's even police that fine you if you decide to play like it's GTA, assuming they see you, of course. Let's start with the driving. It's not actually that bad, but you would hope it's better since 90% of the game is driving. Now, I don't have a wheel and pedals, so I can't speak for how it is on a proper driving game setup, but most people don't have that, so my review is going to be based on a controller. Taxi Life is also just incredibly boring to play. There's almost zero replay value, the city feels completely soulless despite AI being all around you. They just have no depth or any interesting NPCs, and at the end of the day, you're a taxi driver. There isn't really much you do but drive people around. It's not like Farming Simulator or the police simulators where you have variety of tasks to complete and stuff to manage. The only thing here you're managing is your thoughts of why I didn't just Uber. The AI is just plain stupid. They'll crash into you like they didn't even see you, or you simply don't exist. They walk across roads, or sometimes they'll just run into each other for no apparent reason. If I wanted to see stupid drivers on the road, I'd just go and drive in the city of Melbourne and watch a tourist try and hook turn. This is what a hook turn is for people who don't understand what that is. The side of the game that allows you to hire workers seems almost unfinished. The real reason to hire employees is to make money faster through passive income, and each driver does have positives and negatives, which is a lovely touch. But honestly, you'll be fine without touching that part of the game. When you're not driving people around, you can gain XP by exploring the map and discovering landmarks and graffiti to earn yourself some extra XP, which you can use to get passive abilities, and they aren't really game changing. One is literally just forgive one police ticket per day. Cool. Overall, Taxi Life missed the mark. When it launched, it was riddled with issues, and even if you go through the entire game without experiencing any bugs, it's a pretty lifeless and boring experience from start to finish. A taxi driver job just isn't exciting enough to be a simulator. If you do want to turn your brain off and drive around, then you could probably play this game, but if you're a simulator fanatic, don't expect to enjoy it. Now, prefacing this, horror games are not my thing. I'm not one to go and pick up a game like Pneumata, but my friend told me it's on his list for worst games of the year, so I said fine and check it out. It draws inspiration from other horror games like Outlast and Resident Evil, and I was quite surprised because he loves those games. That was until I really started to notice the severe lack of mechanics that actually allow you as a player to uncover the story of what happened to your missing wife. At least that's what I think the story's about, because the story seems to not be important at all in this game. I had to Google the wife's name because I'm not sure I heard her mentioned. Maybe more than once. For a horror game that's all about investigating a cold case, there seems to be a real lack of detective work being done as the player. Now, credit where credit is due, the enemy designs are actually really cool and quite scary. But what's scarier is how poorly coded their AI is. The game promised, and I quote, unpredictable entities, but every single enemy behaves in exactly the same way. The gunplay is whatever, it's pretty tough to mess that up in a single player game, but the melee mechanics are just really strange. The hit reg on melee weapons was so bad sometimes, it felt like I was swinging at a hologram. And in terms of the actual horror aspect, for a game that's aimed as a psychological horror, there seems to be a real overuse of jump scares. The sound design is very poorly mixed. Sometimes it's too quiet, you hardly notice those little sounds. And other times I almost threw my headset across the room. And was sure I was at a point where I was just listening to the same audio on a 10-second loop. The game design doesn't really make you uneasy, it just kind of frustrates you, and the darkness is more annoying than scary. There's basically zero assistance when it comes to navigation, so you kind of just end up walking around aimlessly, getting more and more annoyed until you reach the point where you either find your objective or you uninstall the game. Now, Pneumata was produced by a solo dev, so props to them. But for a $35 game, it's just not good enough. My friend tells me the bugs were even worse at launch. Apparently, you could have your save data wiped right before the end of the game. That would do it for me, because the game gave you absolutely no reason to care about this guy's wife, whatever her name is, or the ending of the game. Skull and Bones. We all knew it was on here. Skull and Bones marked the start of an abysmal year for Ubisoft. After 10 years of development, going from a Black Flag DLC to a full-blown game, and some people believing this game would never actually release, Ubisoft Singapore launched a pirate game. Without sword combat, just a pirate ship simulator. Now, I wanted so badly for this game to do well. As a Sea of Thieves player, I wanted Skull and Bones to be the next big pirate game, but it completely flopped. As of writing this, right now, Skull and Bones has 75 players on Steam, and I almost have that many Patreon members, and that's free. How, after 10 years of development, did this happen? Well, from the get-go, the game simply wasn't engaging enough to play for more than a few hours at a time. Most of the game you spent slowly sailing your ship from one port to another. Combat was just shoot, reload, repair, shoot, reload. It wasn't interesting. You could board other ships and steal their loot, which was really cool, but it was just a cutscene. You couldn't fight on the other ship. The only thing you could do is aim your grappling hooks to actually board them. The combat got stale so incredibly quickly. The unique bosses and sea monsters you could fight were essentially just bullet sponges with a couple unique moves. And those unique moves got pretty old when you're fighting the same enemy for 15 to 20 minutes. After you complete quests, you're greeted with insanely long expositions. It completely breaks the flow of the game, if there was any. I just skipped 90% of cutscenes because they simply weren't interesting and I didn't care. The other 10%? Well, they were unskippable. There was simply no excitement in the game. Just go here, pew pew, sink them, return to port, walk to a person, talk to person, and repeat. For a game that spent 10 years in development, it's completely uninspired. And X-Defiant was the game that died instead of Skull and Bones. Apparently this was due to some deal with the government, but I have no way to actually confirm that. It's just rumors and speculation. Skull and Bones was a complete disappointment, and I feel bad for the small team that's left developing the upcoming seasons. And their hard work is being played by such a small amount of players. It's almost a waste of their talents. Dustborn. Where do I start? Dustborn is the only game I've ever witnessed where the people who cry about a game being too woke are actually correct. Dustborn sold a measly 4,000 copies, and as of writing this, there are 5 people playing it on Steam. And I feel sorry for those 5 people. It hit an all-time player count of just 100 people, which is honestly surprisingly high, but it's an indie game with a small budget of, let me just check my notes here, $250 million. And how many years? 8 years of development time to produce this woke propaganda garbage. The entire game was funded by the government, which is painfully ironic, considering the entire game is how the government can't be trusted. The characters are painfully shallow and honestly could have been written by a primary school student. They all have special abilities, which really aren't that special. One character has the ability to literally gaslight people, not making that up, and you can make up new words like trigger. I honestly thought this game was satire, but a quick Google search will tell you the developer is furious and heavily condemns people criticizing the political viewpoints of the game, which are extremely obvious. Meanwhile, they earned a cool $14 million for the Norwegian government just by producing the game. Insanity. Anyway, let's talk about the gameplay. The game follows Pax, a con artist with the ability to weaponize language. Yep, that's what the Steam page says. You're tasked with transporting a stolen package from Pacifica to Nova Scotia. In order to not get caught, you pose as a punk rock band known as Dustborn. The game's mechanics are just strange. You hold this Game Boy thing called the Meme, which allows you to pull old broadcasts out of people that's affecting them, so you can understand what's happening in the world. In the early portions of the game, the characters you collect respond based on how you treat them. Meanwhile, in the second half of the game, this mechanic is completely removed. Why? Did they not finish the game? Did they not bother because they didn't think people would get this far? Well, I did. Sadly. The story of Dustborn has John F. Kennedy starting the Justice, which is a police force that sent the USA into fascism, hunting down people like Pax who are called anomals, which are just people with abilities. You're like the shitty X-Men. Pax creates negative feelings with words. Gnome is the one who can gaslight people. As you go through the game, every time you stop the bus, you're going to meet a new character. The game just started adding characters to make sure they pleased every group and everyone was being represented. It got stale very quickly. No character was actually developed properly though, they just represented groups. The gameplay is incredibly clunky with oversimplified controls and mechanics. The music parts of the game feel like a bad recreation of Dance Dance Revolution with keys flying towards the middle. But these sequences completely break any flow the game tried to have. For the first hour, all I did was cutscene and talking. It felt like a choose-your-own-adventure where the choices make literally no difference. But the final boss tops it all off. This is the point where I knew the writers of the game had completely given up. The final boss of the game is a random albino white kid dubbed by the community the Creepy Kid. Their real name is Axiom, who is the direct servant of the overseer of Puritans, believing they are the absolute truth. Now, Axiom appears one time in the 4th issue, which is what they call the chapters of the game because it's like a comic book, and then doesn't appear again until the final boss. He now does appear at the start because they added him in update 1.1 because there was just no foreshadowing, but I'm not counting that. When Theo, the dad of the group, tries to approach him while he's standing on a pier, he uses some completely unexplained power and just vaporizes him. Like snaps his fit, like full Thanos snaps him away. Which then imbues Pax's unborn baby, she's pregnant by the way, this is like a whole plot point that she doesn't seem to care about, with the power to use a vocal blast that sends the Creepy Kid into the ocean. Zero explanation. I'm not even kidding. Dustborn is the biggest nothing burger of a game that wanted to be a profound piece of political propaganda. A complete waste of Norwegian taxpayer money, and I cannot believe this game took 250 million to produce in 8 years. But at least the art style is fun. Rocksteady Games wowed us all those years ago with the Batman Arkham series, one of the most visually impressive and engaging single-player story games of the time. So when Rocksteady Games was announced as the developer of Suicide Squad, please don't demonetize me YouTube, Kill the Justice League, fans had never been more excited for a DC game to drop. But the game launched far below the standards we had expected. Suicide Squad is about to receive its final content drop, adding the final playable character. After that time, there will be no more content for the game. Only 1 year after its initial launch, the game is essentially dead in the water. Launching to an all-time peak of 13,000 players, the game failed from the very beginning, which is incredibly disappointing and a waste of an IP that had so much potential. Let's take a look at where Suicide Squad failed to impress audiences. Rocksteady Games already faced major backlash when it was revealed to be a live service looter shooter. With all the other major players in the scene, such as Destiny 2, The Division 2, and hell, even Warframe, audiences weren't happy to hear another live service game would be released. The game's story was subpar. You follow the Brainiac invasion, and the Justice League has been corrupted. Brainiac's presence is felt throughout the entire game, but then you actually get to fight him, and it's a complete letdown. If this game was more character focused, I feel like it would have done a lot better. You're playing as supervillains. King Shark, Captain Boomerang, Deadshot, all these characters could have revolved around extremely different playstyles with unique abilities. But instead of selecting your character, really you're just picking some movement abilities. The actual combat was more focused around the weapons you looted, SMGs, assault rifles. It really didn't feel like a DC Comics game. It felt like a military shooter with aliens. The Brainiac bots are completely bland. They have some weak points and all you do is shoot them one after another. It's really just a point and click title. Any history the Suicide Squad characters had was completely stripped from them and they were handed a gun. If you swapped out the characters, it really wouldn't make much of a difference. Even the skill trees were boring. The skill trees looked incredibly similar to Borderlands, but instead of cool abilities and upgrades, you essentially got 10% more damage with X, or take X% less damage from. It's all just lackluster percentages and numbers. A complete waste of a skill tree. Now, Rocksteady Games obviously have a history of making stunning looking games, and the main cast of characters in Suicide Squad are done so phenomenally well. The facial movements while talking look near to real life, but the world created around that main cast of characters feels completely lifeless, almost like a facade. Think of Wile E. Coyote painting it onto a wall. Kill the Justice League was just a disappointing waste of an IP, stripping the rich history of DC Comics and their universe, and just turning it into a generic live service looter shooter. The Battlefront remaster, if you can call it that, was not only a complete failure from Aspyr, but it was proof that Star Wars fans should never get their hopes up for another Battlefront game ever again. The Battlefront re-release, now don't get me wrong, the original games back in 2004 and 2005 were a blast. I spent hours as a kid playing these games, so I'm not going to be talking about the content of the games because we know it's good. So how did they go and royally f*** up the biggest slam dunk in gaming history? Well, firstly, when the game launched, there were only 2 multiplayer servers available. Not 2 mega servers, 2 servers. 2 games with 64 players each. In multiplayer, there was a grand total of 128 players able to play at any given time, while near 10,000 people jumped onto the game. Now that would actually work because there's only 30 people playing the game at the time of writing this. The game was riddled with bugs. Firstly, the improvements they made to the obviously outdated combat was just weird. They updated the gameplay, but not the graphics. So the Classic Collection was in this weird limbo of being a bad remaster, but also a bad preservation of the original games. This weird improvement of some of the features makes the game really not fun to play. The combat rewards you for essentially aiming somewhat towards an enemy, and the auto-aim feature just took over. The balance of the game had gone completely out of whack, where the dark side villains were so much more powerful than the heroes for the Republic and the Rebellion. The system also hasn't changed much, for where if you're on the losing side, it is significantly more difficult to actually earn a hero or villain and spawn in as them. And by the halfway point, the games are in such a one-sided swing, it's almost impossible to turn the tide of the battle. Whether or not you personally enjoy the gameplay of the Star Wars Classic Collection is not the point. The complete abysmal launch and chance the game had of succeeding on the multiplayer front was completely dead in the water. Dead on arrival. Day 1, gone. Refunded. This gameplay is actually footage from my friend's YouTube video because I had already refunded it and I wasn't going to buy it again. Yeah. Any hope Star Wars fans do have of a new Battlefront were definitely killed off with the launch of this, so I'm still not expecting anything. Concord. We all knew it was going to be number 1. Let's be honest, we all knew Concord had to be number 1 on this list because, well, the game simply doesn't exist anymore. The game was shut down after only 2 weeks, and later, Sony shut down the entire studio. The game was in development for 8 years and cost a whopping $400 million, which was the biggest waste of money possible. They might as well have just burnt it. Sony had to offer refunds to everyone who bought the game. The game itself wasn't absolutely horrible. It was okay. But the reason it failed so badly was because in a world where there are so many other hero shooters for free, there was no reason to buy Concord, especially at full price. The marketing of the game was terrible, which explains why the game opened to a player count of 700 on Steam. But to even convince that many people to buy a hero shooter when every other game, even remotely like Concord, is free, there's just simply no reason to buy it over those established games. Now, since the game launched, the reveal trailer and gameplay reveals, they both had 10 times more dislikes than likes. I'm using the extension, so it's the only metric we have. The original reveal showed it off as essentially a Guardians of the Galaxy ripoff, but when it was revealed to be a hero shooter, there was absolutely zero chance this game was going to succeed, full price or not. The game didn't know what it wanted to be, the abilities didn't flow with the game, the combat momentum was all over the place, and it just overall wasn't a fun game to play. Now obviously I'm not going to be able to go and record that gameplay because the game doesn't exist anymore, and I don't even know why I'm talking about the gameplay because well, it's not like you can go and play it. Yeah. And that's why Concord is the worst game of 2024. So, from the indie games to those large AAA studios and multi-$100 million budgets, no one is safe from developing and releasing a terrible game. 2024 was one of the toughest years for gaming in recent memory. With mass layoffs and many games struggling to reach an audience, we can only hope 2025 is a better year for the industry. So, let me know what games were on your worst of 2024 list. A massive thanks to the patrons supporting the channel because this video cost a fair bit to produce. I can't believe I bought all those games. Well, at least I owned a few. Thanks Ubisoft for giving me Skull and Bones on launch.